Okay. Can everyone see my screen okay? All right, here we go.
School has well-equipped classrooms, labs, music and art studios, and a brand new gymnasium that's the envy of traveling sports teams. He has his pick of AP classes, all taught by instructors with graduate degrees in their disciplines. His AP physics class is designing robots in the school's new makerspace studio, and his Spanish class is planning a trip to Costa Rica. He meets regularly with his school counselor to chart a course to his dream college. Halfway through Jacob's junior year, his dad loses his job, and his family goes to live with his grandparents in a nearby town. His new high school is just 25 minutes away from his old one, but it feels like a different world. The classrooms are crowded, and technology and textbooks are out of date. Jacob can't take the calculus class he needs for his college major because not enough students enrolled this year. He wants to meet with his school counselor about it, but she's so overscheduled that he's been waiting weeks to get an appointment with her. While his former classmates are in Costa Rica, Jacob is adapting to learning Spanish in an online course. Jacob isn't real, but his story illustrates the reality of how school funding affects the experiences of most students in New Hampshire. So how does school funding work in New Hampshire? Who decides how much money schools get? And where does the money come from? Let's take a closer look. According to the New Hampshire Constitution, every student has the right to the opportunity for an adequate education paid for by the state. In 2020, the state gave districts $3,708 per student in base adequacy funds, which is meant to cover the total combined cost of teachers, instructional materials, facilities, transportation, a school counselor, a principal, and technology. In addition, districts receive differentiated aid funds based on their number of special education students, English language learners, students who qualify for free or reduced price lunch, and students who are not deemed proficient in reading by 3rd grade. So why did Jacob's school experience change so much when he moved to a new town? What made the difference? Mainly, property values. In reality, no school in New Hampshire operates solely on state funds. A large portion of every school's budget comes from local property taxes. New Hampshire doesn't have a sales or income tax. Instead, people and businesses pay taxes based on the value of their homes and buildings, and those taxes pay for schools. There are different reasons why a town has more property wealth than others, like if it is near a body of water, or if there is a lot of industry with fewer residents. Districts with more property wealth per student are able to spend a lot more on their schools. So while the state funds about $3,708 per student, the amount that a school district spends varies widely, with some spending less than $15,000 per student and some spending more than $25,000 per student. But wait, how can that be? Well, people have been asking that question for a long time. In the early 90s, 5 school districts sued the state over the way it pays for public education. The New Hampshire Supreme Court ruled in their favor, citing the state constitution. The language commands, in no uncertain terms, that the state provide an education to all its citizens and that it support all public schools. No laws were changed as a result. So in 1997, the same school districts took the state back to court and won again. This time, the state legislature responded by creating the statewide property tax and changing the formula so that the state funds schools based on the number of students they serve. The funding formula has been revised several times since then, but in many ways, not much has changed. And so another group of schools sued the state in 2019, asserting that the $3,708 schools receive from the state per student is not adequate to fund an education. In 2020, the state legislature created a commission of lawmakers and community members to study school funding and make recommendations for how to fund a more equitable education system for all students across New Hampshire. There are no easy answers. The stakes are high, and they're different for everyone. What do you think? What does an adequate education consist of? How can inequities between districts be addressed? Who should pay for it?
Great, thanks, Carrie. Let me pull up my screen here. All right, can everybody see that okay? Great. So as Carrie said, my name is Jordan Hensley. I am a policy analyst at the Carsey School of Public Policy, and I have had the privilege over the last year and change to help support the Commission to Study School Funding. It's great to see everyone here, see some names on the list, some new faces and some faces that have been with us for quite a while. Glad you're all here. I just want to let folks know that I'll be giving an overview of the Commission's work. School funding is an incredibly complicated and nuanced topic, and this is really going to be the 35,000-foot kind of view of school funding, and hopefully as a jumping off point for all of us to have a conversation. And I really encourage folks to read the full Commission report, as well as the report prepared by the Commission's partners at the American Institutes for Research, both of which are available online. So what was the Commission asked to do? They were created by the legislature and given a charge to do several different things, including review the education funding formula in the state and make recommendations to ensure a uniform and equitable design for financing the cost of an adequate education for all public school students, to determine whether the New Hampshire funding formula complies with court mandates that have been handed down through the years, to identify trends and disparities in pre-K through 12th grade performance, to establish the cost of an adequate education, and to study the distribution of education funding costs across different New Hampshire properties. And the Commission met almost 100 times between January of 2020 and November of 2020, as well as working with the first outside analysis of New Hampshire data in nearly 40 years. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go along. The Commission, in pursuit of its charge, came up with several key questions, some guiding questions. Things under those guiding questions included, what constitutes an adequate education today? What are the scope of the current inequities relative to the opportunity for all students to have an adequate education? As you saw in the video, that is a mandate from the state Supreme Court. What does an adequate education cost? And then how do those costs of adequacy vary by type of student need? And how should those factors be represented in New Hampshire's school funding formula? Some other questions that the Commission considered are things like, how does community property wealth affect educational opportunity? What are the sources of revenue that could pay for an adequate education? And how can a funding formula take into account differences in capacity to raise revenue between different towns? And the Commission did this in a number of ways, as I mentioned, a lot of meetings and public comment sessions, over 200 hours, all of which are available online. The pandemic was sort of a blessing and a curse in that way. We were able to record everything that was done via Zoom and place that online. The Commission conducted significant stakeholder engagement to tax groups, senior citizen groups, student groups, school and municipal leaders across the state, educators, and community members and citizens of New Hampshire like yourselves that are here today. The Commission also worked with the American Institutes for Research, as I mentioned, who helped take an analytical dive into New Hampshire's publicly available data. And the Commission also contracted with the Carsey School of Public Policy and its engagement arm, New Hampshire Listens, to help provide logistical support and research and analysis support. Another thing that the Commission did was a couple of different surveys, a survey of educators and a representative survey through the UNH Survey Center and the Granite State Poll. And the Commission issued a final report on December 1st, 2020. And again, that is available online for folks as well. So what does school funding look like currently in New Hampshire? So first, the good news, students in New Hampshire on average perform at relatively high levels with respect to outcome measures. And we'll talk a little bit more about outcome measures in a minute. But the main publicly available outcome measures that are available in New Hampshire are attendance rates, graduation rates, and performance on standardized assessments. New Hampshire districts with that average high level of performance also spend a relatively high amount per pupil as a statewide average compared to most other states. However, the state funding, so the share of per pupil funding that comes from the state of New Hampshire and not the locality, not your town, that is the lowest in the country. New Hampshire is 50 out of 50. State funding is also fairly flat per pupil. There is some differentiated aid, but the magnitude of the aid, the amount that it changes, the base amount that goes out is relatively low. And that means that local districts end up bearing most of the burden for paying for K-12 education in New Hampshire. The commission found through the course of its work that districts with lower property values, so less property wealth in the town, per pupil spend less on average than districts with higher property wealth. And districts with the highest poverty rates among their students typically have outcomes that are 1 to 2 standard deviations below state average. For folks that may not have had a statistics class in the recent past or may not be as familiar with standard deviation, if you think about state average being the 50th percentile, 2 standard deviations below state average is somewhere in the neighborhood of the 5th percentile. So we have districts in this state that are achieving at an average level in the district at the 5th percentile statewide. So there are real differences in outcomes among different school districts in New Hampshire. And something the commission also found in its work is that states that direct more funds to districts with fewer resources improve student outcomes in those districts where resources are directed to. Some examples of states that have done that in the last 20, 30 years are places like Massachusetts and New Jersey. So let's break this down a little bit more. This idea that districts with the lowest poverty rates have outcomes that are better than state average, and districts with the highest poverty rates have outcomes that are much below state average. So if you're looking at this chart, which is from the report that AIR prepared for the commission, you'll see the relationship between student outcomes. And again, those outcomes are based on the publicly available data. And so those are attendance rates, graduation rates, and performance on standardized state tests. Now, there are very well maybe other outcome measures that one might be interested in capturing. Unfortunately, we don't currently have that data, and there has been discussion about the Department of Education perhaps collecting more and different kinds of data to help support the kinds of student outcomes that we'd like to see. So you'll see on the left-hand side on the y-axis there, the outcome factor score. So that's those 3 attendance, graduation rates, and test performance. Those are them combined into one score. And these are standard deviations. So 0 is the 50th percentile, that is state average. And then on the x-axis, on the bottom there, you have the free and reduced price lunch rate in a district. And so you'll see it goes from 0 to about 60%. And the size of the bubbles in this chart are the number of students in a district. So you'll notice right away, big bubble in the bottom right-hand corner, that's the Manchester School District. And you can see that they have a large share of students that are eligible for free and reduced price lunch. And they also have outcomes that are much lower than state average. And an interesting thing about this chart is that you'll see a really strong correlation here. A lot of times, if you're looking at data, if you go back and look behind the numbers, you'll see it's not a clear pattern necessarily, but in New Hampshire, the pattern is extremely clear. That slope is very strong, and you can see, so there's a strong relationship between the share of students in a district that are eligible for free and reduced price lunch, the share of students in poverty, and their outcomes. And we want all students to have the opportunity to achieve an adequate education, an adequate outcome, and so that is worrying. So how does New Hampshire compare with other states in New England? So in New Hampshire, districts with higher needs tend to have fewer education resources. And so if you look at these charts, on the left-hand side, on the y-axis there, you'll see relative spending. So one is at state average spending. And then on the x-axis on the bottom there, you'll see relative poverty. So one is state average level of poverty in a district, and then moving up and down from there. And you'll see that New Hampshire has an extremely what education finance scholars would call a regressive funding system. So as poverty increases, fewer resources are going to those more impoverished districts. You can compare that to our neighbors to the south, both in real life and on this slide, Massachusetts, who have a more what was known as a progressive funding distribution. So they direct more resources to districts with greater poverty. And you'll see that Vermont also has a progressive funding formula, has a progressive distribution of funding, although less so than Massachusetts, while Connecticut, Maine, and Rhode Island also have regressive funding systems. However, New Hampshire, again, has the most regressive funding system in the country. So it has the sharpest downward slope out of any state. If you did 50 of these, New Hampshire would be the most regressive. And so the commission looked at a lot of different data, talked to a lot of folks around the state, gathered a lot of information, and decided to move towards adequacy defined in terms of outcomes. So I'll describe a little bit about what the current model is and what an outcome-based approach might look like. So the current formula that exists is an input-based formula. It's kind of an accounting model. So you add up a list of all the projected associated costs, and you determine a base amount, which last year was about $3,700. And then you can assign some extra weights for students who have special needs, who are low income, who are English learners, this differentiated aid. That's something that everyone agrees. Some students who have greater needs require greater resources to help them achieve. However, this outcome-based model is not as tied to the reality of what's going on in schools as it could be. And that's why the commission has endorsed kind of this outcome-based approach. So instead of what does it cost to run a school, how much does it cost for all these things, what does it cost to educate a student? And you do this by constructing a composite outcome score, as the commission's partners at the American Institutes for Research did, out of graduation rates, performance on state assessments, and attendance. And you can determine a desired level of performance for all. And the commission, in most of its deliberations, talked about setting that performance at average statewide performance. New Hampshire, on average, is doing very well in K-12 education. Typically, if you look at a survey of all states, New Hampshire is in the top 5. So on average, New Hampshire students are doing great, and that's a great target to aim for. But you could set that at, instead of the 50th percentile, you could set it at the 40th percentile, the 75th percentile, wherever you think that's appropriate, wherever the legislature thinks that's appropriate. Then you can statistically determine, based on student characteristics, what extra costs are required by students with different needs in particular districts to get to state average. And based on this, you can predict a cost required for each district to achieve adequacy, kind of through this student-centered model that's looking at student characteristics and costs to achieve a particular outcome, rather than we need 30 chairs per classroom, every school needs a principal, etc. So that's defining adequacy and what adequacy might look like under the commission's proposal. But then how do you fund that? And state funding under the commission's proposal would be defined by district means. Again, there's kind of this one-size-fits-all approach to the funding formula that currently exists, and every district receives a relatively flat amount of student aid per pupil. However, this puts a lot of burden on local school districts to raise the revenue required to get students to the outcome levels that they want them to get to. And some districts are not able to raise enough local tax dollars to fund an adequate education. And we see this, property tax rates vary widely across New Hampshire, from a high of $2,250 to a low of $270. So there's quite a difference across different communities, and that's based mainly on the amount of property value that is in a given town. The commission approach is based on means, capacity to pay. it would involve a reasonable and proportional contribution from all cities and towns, and then state funds that make up the difference needed for every district. And the commission believes that that would improve student and taxpayer equity and help give all students the opportunity for an adequate education. Let me show graphically what that might look like. The commission was agnostic on the exact revenue source, but one thing that was floated that does exist currently is the statewide property tax. The commission conducted several surveys, and in the Granite State poll that they conducted, there was not a clear consensus about a funding source for education. And most folks in New Hampshire have traditionally said that they're opposed to broad-based taxes. And so the state property tax is an existing mechanism that could be used in a reasonable, equitable, proportional way. And it might look something like Massachusetts Chapter 70 program. So if you look here, you'll see school district spending for a number of towns in Massachusetts. And if you look here on the left-hand side, that's the net of total school spending. So all of these are showing 100% of the school spending in these districts. The dark blue is the local contribution. All these towns from Lawrence to Westwood are paying the same effective property tax rate, but they raise a lot more money through that property tax rate in Westwood than they do in Lawrence. And so the state comes in and fills in the rest with state aid. And so everyone is paying the same amount towards education, but it recognizes that there are differences in capacity across towns. And so the state fills in those gaps to get to the level of adequacy that the legislature defines. Another key piece of this, based on what the commission heard, is a property tax relief program. So the commission, as I said, had a lot of meetings, heard a lot of public comment, and something that came up repeatedly is that not everyone in every town is in the same situation. So one can think of towns with significant property wealth, but there are folks who are living on fixed incomes, seniors, maybe folks whose houses have appreciated in value substantially over the years in a way that doesn't match up with their cash flow, their income stream. And so the commission was really committed that a property tax relief program be a pillar of any kind of school funding reform. And the current program does not work particularly well. The commission heard significant testimony from the Department of Revenue Administration to this point. It fails to direct relief to homeowners with limited means. It has outdated eligibility requirements, so very few homeowners actually qualify. It's underfunded by the state, and the current program has a maximum of $200, which is not nothing, but relative to the burden that many folks are feeling in terms of property taxes, it's not enough. Some of the updates that have been proposed for fiscal 22 and that are currently being debated in the legislature are improvements for tax fairness for low and moderate income homeowners in every city and town with up-to-date income and home value eligibility thresholds that's actually fully funded by the state. And there's going to be some deliberation about what the maximum benefit is, but some of the discussion in the commission and some of the bills that have been floated is a $1,000 benefit, increasing that up from $200 to try to give more relief to folks dealing with high property tax burdens. In the future, some areas that the commission identified and the members of the commission identified as places to look include relief for renters and tax deferral programs. So when we put this all together, these are kind of the four main pillars of what the commission has proposed. It's costing. So you calculate for school districts to educate students to a statewide average outcome determined by the legislature. You fund it. You make sure that every district has access to the resources that they need to fund their school budgets. A tax relief program so that low and moderate income homeowners have some relief, especially if a statewide property tax were to be changed or implemented in some way. And then legislate it. Implement durable bipartisan legislation that reflects the state's constitutional obligation repeatedly given to the state by the state Supreme Court to provide an opportunity for an adequate education for all of our kids, and to not have this wild variation in town by town in terms of achievement and opportunity. This again was a high level overview of what the commission worked on, but all the presentations, the reports, related resource materials received by the commission, all of the testimony from different stakeholders, that can all be found online. The Carsey School, we host the school funding, the commission's website. You can also find all the recordings of commission meetings, and you can submit questions and comments. We have a Qualtrics form, survey form that you can fill out online, or you can contact the commission there at schoolfunding.commission@unh.edu. Thank you for listening in, and looking forward to getting to chat with you all about school funding here.